Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below, because I guarantee you, the story I am about to tell could happen in your own neighborhood. This is a work of fiction, but let me promise you something right now. The sheer, unadulterated greed, the suffocating arrogance, and the absolute betrayal you are about to witness are as real as the dirt under my fingernails. If you have ever sacrificed your own blood, sweat, and tears for a child, only to watch them turn their back on you for a shiny new life, you will want to hear every single word of this. At his wedding, my son stood before 300 guests at the Fairmont Copley Plaza, arguably the most expensive hotel in Boston. He held a crystal flute of vintage champagne. I sat in the back row with my wife, Alice, waiting for a simple thank you. I was waiting for him to acknowledge that I had completely liquidated my entire retirement fund, draining 30 years of saving and sweating over greasy engines to pay for this night. Instead, he looked me dead in the eye, smiled a cold smile, and announced into the microphone that he was ashamed to be my son. He told a room full of millionaires that the name Bennett was a stain on his ambition. He announced, with a sickening pride puffing up his chest, that he was legally changing his last name to Harrington to honor his wife's wealthy family. And the worst part? Everyone laughed. They applauded his courage. They cheered for his social climbing, as if he had just conquered a mountain. I stood there in my cheap, rented tuxedo, with $85 of crippling debt resting heavily on my shoulders, and a heart that felt like it had just stopped beating. He thought he was escaping a legacy of poverty. He did not know that the name Bennett, the very name he was tossing into the garbage, was the exact key to a dormant empire. That very same week, I inherited $10 million in liquid cash and a controlling stake in a $50 million steel conglomerate. But he had already signed his rights away. My name is George Bennett. I am 70 years old. I have deep, dark grease permanently embedded under my fingernails. I spent 50 long, grueling years as an auto mechanic, fixing other people's mistakes so that my family could have a roof over their heads. I foolishly believed that if you worked hard, you would be rewarded with respect in your twilight years. I was wrong. The reward in this world does not come from sacrifice. It comes from power, and I was about to get a lot of it. The massive crystal chandeliers of the Fairmont Copley Plaza hummed with a golden light that hurt my eyes. My wife sat beside me, clutching her worn leather handbag. She was 68 years old, and her heart was failing her. Her doctors had strictly warned her to avoid stress. Yet, here we were, enduring an event that had drained the absolute life out of us. I looked around the sprawling ballroom at the sickening sea of imported silk and diamonds. The floral arrangements alone cost $12,000. I knew the exact price because I was the one who wrote the check. I knew it all because Brandon had demanded it. "Dad, you only get married once," Brandon had told me 6 months ago. "The Harringtons are used to a certain standard. We cannot look cheap. We cannot look cheap." That phrase echoed mockingly in my head as I looked at our table. Table 24, the very last table in the entire room, strategically placed right next to the swinging kitchen doors. Hidden away, meanwhile, in the center of the room, sat the Harrington family. Rich and Susan Harrington, they owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Boston. Rich was laughing loudly. He clapped Brandon on the shoulder, treating my son less like a man and more like a prize poodle. Alice's fragile fingers were shaking uncontrollably. "George," she whispered, "are you okay?" "I am fine, Alice," I lied. Before this wedding, my humble savings account held exactly $85. It was supposed to be the money for Alice's impending heart surgery. Now, the balance was an absolute zero. I had even put the final $15,000 deposit on a high-interest credit card. Suddenly, Brandon stood up at the head table. The entire room went dead silent. He tapped his silver spoon against his champagne glass. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight," Brandon said smoothly into the microphone. "Tonight is undeniably the happiest night of my entire life. Not just because I have officially married the absolute woman of my dreams, but because I am finally coming home." I frowned deeply. He had lived in my house for 18 years. "I grew up in a very small, cramped house," Brandon said, his tone dropping dramatically. He made it sound like he was raised in a dirty gutter. "My parents were simple people. They lived very small, unremarkable lives. They were completely content with mediocrity. A low murmur went through the wealthy crowd. Alice squeezed my hand so incredibly hard. But I always wanted more, Brandon said. When I met Brittany, I realized that names carry actual power. The name Bennett has always felt like a rusty cage to me. It is a name associated with cheap grease and very small paychecks. The grand ballroom was deadly silent now. So, tonight, Brandon declared proudly, I want to make a very special announcement. As of tomorrow morning, I am no longer Brandon Bennett. I have legally filed the paperwork to take the name Harrington. I am Brandon Harrington. The deafening applause started instantly from the head table. Rich and Susan Harrington stood up quickly and clapped furiously. The entire massive room was an absolute thunder of roaring applause. I sat there, completely frozen. I slowly turned my head and looked at Alice. She was visibly gasping for air. Her face had turned a terrifying, sickly shade of gray. Alice, I shouted in panic. I stood up so fast that I violently knocked over my heavy wooden chair. Hundreds of wealthy people turned their heads to look directly at the old, greasy mechanic and his sick wife. Brandon looked deeply annoyed that we were ruining his perfect moment. Brittany swiftly grabbed the microphone. Oh, please do not worry, everyone, she said smoothly, rolling her eyes. It is just a little bit of drama. Do not let their poverty ruin our beautiful party. A distinct, cruel ripple of laughter went through the room. That was the exact moment that broke me. I moved with cold, calculated precision. I slowly reached into the inner breast pocket of my rented jacket. I pulled out a crisp white envelope. Inside was a certified cashier's check for exactly $10. Sow zero. It was the absolute last of our remaining liquidity. It was the money meant for our basic food and heating oil for the entire next year. I had stupidly brought it as a final wedding gift. I looked at the heavy check in my calloused hand. I looked up at Brandon. He was smiling broadly. He was a Harrington now, and Harringtons clearly did not need $10. Souzen from a pathetic old mechanic. I calmly walked toward the large trash can near the swinging kitchen doors. I held the check up high in the air. I made absolutely sure that Brandon saw me holding it. For one brief, terrifying second, his arrogant smile wavered. I deliberately crumpled the check into a tight ball. I dropped it right into the rotting garbage. Then I turned my back on him. I walked over to Alice. Come on, Alice, I said. We are leaving right now. We slowly walked out of the silent ballroom. We walked out of the luxurious hotel and directly into the freezing Boston night. We sat in the cramped back seat of a rusted Uber in total silence. We eventually entered our rundown neighborhood. We pulled up directly to our small, cramped ranch-style house. The cheap paint was actively peeling off the siding. I gently helped Alice inside. The house was freezing cold. We sat completely alone in the heavy silence. On the scratched coffee table in front of us, there was a massive pile of unopened mail. I heavily sighed and picked up the stack. Right at the very bottom was a very thick, cream-colored envelope. I quickly looked at the return address. Sterling & Associates, Attorneys at Law, New York. NY opened it, carefully slicing the thick paper. Inside was a crisp letter. Dear Mr. Bennett, we are writing to formally inform you of the passing of Mr. Silas Bennett of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. As the primary executors of the Bennett Family Trust, we have been actively trying to locate you. Silas Bennett, my father. I completely dropped the heavy letter. My father was an incredibly wealthy steel magnate who firmly believed that basic human kindness was a fatal weakness. I had run away when I was 18, preferring a life of poverty to his cruelty. I shakily picked up the letter again. It stated that my older brother had died 5 years ago. My mother had passed away decades ago. Since you are now the sole surviving biological child, you are the primary beneficiary. I completely stopped breathing. The estate currently includes liquid assets totaling exactly $10. Zine. It also includes the controlling equity shares in Bennett Steel Industries, currently valued at approximately $50. Silzen. $60 million. I slowly looked around my freezing, pathetic living room. But there was more. I noticed a final paragraph. However, Mr. Silas Bennett included a highly specific lineage clause. The massive assets are to be distributed solely to individuals who legally bear the surname Bennett. I read that sentence again. Legally bear the surname Bennett. My son had proudly stood on a well-lit stage just 2 short hours ago. He had proudly signed binding legal documents to change his name forever. He had publicly mocked the very thing that was about to make him a billionaire. A dark, dry laugh suddenly bubbled up deep in my throat. "What is it, George?" Alice asked, trembling. I silently handed her the heavy letter. "Read it, Alice," I commanded softly. She read the pages silently. She looked up at me. "George," she whispered, 60 million, boss? And Brandon? Brandon just made the single most expensive speech in human history," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "He threw away the name. He wanted to be a Harrington." The very next morning, a high-end Lincoln smoothly pulled up to our broken curb. Leonard Sterling, a tall, thin man in a custom-tailored suit, stepped out. He entered our small living room and placed his expensive briefcase squarely on the scratched coffee table. "Mr. Bennett, I will be very brief," he said professionally. "The massive transfer of funds is completely ready. The trust is firmly divided. You have immediate, unrestricted access to the $10 million in liquid cash. The $50 million in equity will finalize in 6 months. However, the strict name clause entirely disqualifies your son." "The massive money is yours, George," Mr. Sterling, I said, leaning forward intently. "I want you to launch a full, comprehensive financial investigation into Rich Harrington and his company, Harrington Development." Sterling smiled a terrifying, shark-like smile. "Consider it done." 3 days later, the secure smartphone Sterling had sent me buzzed. Sterling's forensic team had completely vivisected Harrington Development's private finances. Rich Harrington was effectively drowning in massive debt. He had recently taken out a massive $12 million high-interest bridge loan just to break ground on his highly publicized Seaport luxury condo project. I immediately called Sterling. "Buy the debt," I commanded smoothly. "Buy the $12 million note through an anonymous shell corporation controlled by my blind trust. Become his primary creditor." Exactly 2 weeks after the disastrous wedding, a brand new, aggressive black Porsche Cayenne loudly pulled into my cracked driveway. Brandon confidently stepped out, looking exactly like a rich man. Brittany slowly stepped out of the passenger side, visibly curling her lip in intense disgust at my house. They aggressively walked into the small living room. "Here is the situation," Brandon announced arrogantly. "Rich Harrington has graciously offered me a highly exclusive buy-in on his massive next project. It is the absolute chance of a lifetime, but there is a massive buy-in fee. I need exactly $200. $1,000 by this Friday. I do not have $200. $1,000, son," I said, perfectly feigning defeat. Brittany rolled her eyes. "We perfectly know you do not have liquid cash, George. But you are currently sitting on a massive unused asset." She pointed a sharp finger at the floor. "This house. You want us to sell our house?" Alice whispered in terror. "We need you to sell it right now," Brandon corrected coldly. "Rich clearly says if I bring this massive capital, I am instantly made a full partner." Brittany casually tossed a glossy brochure onto the table. "Sunny Acres Assisted Living," she announced proudly. "It is way up in New Hampshire. You would be very comfortable there in a home." "You want to permanently put us in a home?" I asked. "It is a community," Brittany snapped. "You are being incredibly selfish right now." Brandon pulled a typed document from his jacket. "This is a highly binding letter of intent," Brandon commanded. "It clearly states that you legally agree to list the property for immediate sale, and that all proceeds will be immediately transferred to me. If I signed this, I would instantly be homeless. But I knew something he did not know. Exactly yesterday, Leonard Sterling had quietly filed a massive deed transfer. I had legally moved the entire house into the highly protected Bennett family trust. My signature on this piece of paper was legally worthless. It was a trap. "Okay," I said softly. Grabbing a cheap pen, I deliberately made my hand shake to look weak. I signed my name. Brandon snatched it greedily. "You finally did the right thing, Dad," he said. They arrogantly walked out of our house exactly like they had just taken out the trash. 3 agonizing days dragged by. The massive for sale sign stood in my front yard like a mocking tombstone. On Tuesday morning, a delivery courier aggressively ran up the cracked driveway with a package. I opened it in the kitchen. Beneath the thick plastic was a heavy, incredibly expensive mahogany frame. Behind the glass was a highly official legal document. Decree of change of name in the matter of Brandon James Bennett. ordered that the name of the petitioner be permanently changed to Brandon James Harrington. He had actually framed his ultimate betrayal. Tucked into the corner was a small card. Dad, thought you would definitely want a nice keepsake. Welcome to the future. Best, Brandon Harrington. I slowly picked up the heavy frame. I placed it directly on the dusty mantel, right next to a smiling photograph of Brandon graduating from college. Alice touched the cold glass. Why would you put that horrible thing up there? She asked, crying. It is a powerful reminder, I said firmly, when he inevitably comes crawling back here crying. I want him to look directly at that mantle. I did not disinherit him, Alice. He legally disinherited himself. The very next afternoon, another text arrived. It was a direct, arrogant command. Come to the Harrington estate at 7:00 p.m. tonight. We are celebrating the official name change. Dress appropriately. We were walking right into the lion's den. I took the unlimited black debit card Leonard Sterling had provided me and walked directly into the absolute finest wine merchant in downtown Boston. I asked for a 1982 Chateau Petrus. The bottle cost exactly $200. To an untrained, arrogant eye, it looked like garbage. I deliberately placed the expensive bottle into a cheap, crinkled brown paper grocery bag. We drove to the extremely wealthy suburb of Weston. The massive Harrington estate was an absolute monstrosity of aggressive new money. I parked my rusted Honda Civic near the dark hedges and gently helped Alice up to the massive double doors. The grand foyer was entirely gold. We walked into the crowded dining room. Brandon was standing in the center, wearing a velvet smoking jacket. Brittany was hanging heavily on his arm. Rich Harrington saw us first. He was already drunk. Well, look exactly who it is. Rich boomed loudly, his voice echoing off the marble. The Bennetts. The entire room went completely quiet. They openly judged my Sears dress shirt and the cheap brown paper bag in my hand. Brandon quickly walked over. Dad, he hissed aggressively. Why are you carrying a dirty grocery bag in here? Put it in the kitchen and disappear. No, son, I said firmly. I walked straight toward Rich Harrington. Mr. Harrington, I brought a bottle to properly celebrate the brand new name. Rich arrogantly took the bag with exactly 2 fingers. Oh, look at this, everyone. Let us see exactly what the local mechanic highly recommends. He reached deep into the bag and pulled out the dusty bottle. He frowned heavily. Petrus? Never heard of it in my life. Looks incredibly old, George. Did you accidentally find this rotting in your garage? Loud laughter instantly rippled through the room. Brittany covered her mouth to hide a cruel giggle. It is a very fine French wine, I said calmly. French? Rich scoffed. I only drink Napa cabs. This looks incredibly thin. It has probably turned entirely to cheap vinegar. He carelessly handed the bottle to a waiter. Open it. Let us all see what cheap swill George considers a gift. The waiter took the bottle. His eyes instantly widened in shock. Sir, he said softly, this is a highly vintage, incredibly rare wine. It should properly decant for at least an entire hour. Just pour the damn thing, Rich ordered aggressively. The waiter carefully poured a small amount into Rich's massive glass. Rich violently threw it back like a cheap shot of tequila. He instantly made a massive face of disgust. Yuck! He shouted, slamming the heavy glass down. Sour! It completely tastes like dirt. It is absolutely spoiled, George. Are you actively trying to poison me? This is pure garbage. Brandon looked absolutely furious. Dad, why did you bring cheap, spoiled wine to a high-end party like this? It is not cheap, Brandon, I said evenly. Brittany aggressively picked up the bottle by the neck. Dump it out immediately, she commanded the waiter. Go get Mr. Harrington a real drink from the cellar. Wait, I said. The entire room went dead silent. I walked calmly over to the waiter. If you are not going to drink it, I certainly will. I smoothly took a clean glass, poured myself a generous amount, and took a slow sip. It was pure silk. I slowly reached into my tuxedo pocket and pulled out the crisp store receipt. I placed it face up on the table. It is definitely an acquired taste, I said steadily. Rich arrogantly picked up the slip of paper. He read the final total, $200. He completely froze. His arrogant mouth dropped slightly open. Brandon aggressively snatched the receipt right out of Rich's hand. All the blood instantly drained from his face. Dad, he whispered in absolute shock. Where did you get this? Did you steal a credit card? I bought it in cash, I said smoothly. I wanted to publicly celebrate your brand new name with something entirely worthy of a king. I looked back at Rich. But you clearly said it tasted exactly like dirt. I guess you were absolutely right. Some rare things are simply too incredibly sophisticated for this room. I turned to the waiter. Cork it securely. I am taking it home. I confidently walked out with Alice. As we drove home, I smoothly backed out of the long driveway. Friday, Alice, I said. Friday is the massive closing. Thursday morning arrived, at exactly 10:00 a.m., a massive stark white van aggressively pulled up to the curb. It had absolutely no windows in the back. On the side it said, Sunny Acres Memory Care Transport. The heavy back doors flew open. Two massive orderlies stepped out. Right behind the van, Brandon and Brittany arrived in the black Porsche. Brandon held a thick clipboard. I violently blocked the front door. What exactly is this? Brandon? I demanded. This is the ultimate solution, Dad, Brandon said coldly. The final walkthrough is today. This house absolutely needs to be empty, and frankly, I do not trust your current state of mind. You aggressively came to a formal dinner, holding a bottle of wine that you wildly claimed cost $5,000. You are clearly suffering from advanced dementia. He held up a legal paper. I showed the wine receipt to a judge early this morning. I showed him the letter you signed legally agreeing to sell the house. I explained that you are rapidly squandering your assets. It was a fraudulent emergency temporary guardianship order. He had told a massive lie, and a judge had signed it. I am actively placing you in a safe, secure environment, Brandon said smoothly. He aggressively turned to the massive men, grabbed the bags, and helped them forcefully into the van. If they resist at all, use restraints. Brittany confidently walked up the wooden steps. It is entirely for the best, George, she said sweetly. The two massive orderlies aggressively stepped up. One of them reached out for me. Sir, please do not make this physically difficult, the man said. I violently grabbed his thick forearm, squeezed incredibly hard, and twisted. He instantly let go, yelling out in severe pain. Alice suddenly screamed in pure terror. The second orderly had illegally entered through the kitchen door and was violently dragging Alice through the narrow hallway. She was clawing wildly at his massive arms. She was having a massive panic attack. I roared furiously. I violently ran back into the house and hit the massive orderly exactly like a professional linebacker. The orderly dropped Alice, turned aggressively on me, and punched me hard in the chest. I violently shoved him toward the front door. Get out of my house! I yelled furiously. Brandon ran inside and aggressively pulled out his smartphone to start recording video. Look at this, he shouted triumphantly. This is absolute proof. They urgently need to be sedated, Mike. Get the heavy sedative. Mike aggressively ran back and holding a massive, terrifying syringe. I slowly backed up and reached into my pocket. I pulled out the highly secure black smartphone Leonard Sterling had sent me. I pressed the button. It rang exactly once. Sterling, I said loudly. They are here. They have a fraudulent court order. They have massive orderlies with heavy syringes. They are violently trying to take Alice. She is having a severe heart episode. Put me immediately on speaker, Sterling commanded. I aggressively pressed the speaker button. Mr. Brandon Harrington. Leonard Sterling's voice boomed aggressively from the small speaker. I represent the multi-million-dollar Bennett Family Trust. And I currently represent my client, Mr. George Bennett. You are currently trespassing violently on private property legally owned by the Bennett Family Trust. The emergency guardianship order you fraudulently obtained was based entirely on massive perjury. I have already formally filed an emergency motion to stay that fraudulent order. It has already been officially faxed to the local police precinct. Brandon looked completely confused. That is a complete lie, he stammered nervously. He literally bought a $5,000 bottle of wine. He is totally broke. He is absolutely not broke, Sterling said, his voice cutting like a razor. I am talking about the absolute fact that George Bennett is the sole primary beneficiary of a private estate currently valued at exactly $60 million. The silence in the ruined living room was absolutely deafening. The massive orderlies instantly lowered their aggressive hands and hid the terrifying syringe. $60 million, Brandon whispered, his entire worldview completely collapsing in real time. I clearly heard the loud police sirens getting incredibly close outside. I glared menacingly at the terrified orderlies. Get out! I roared. They completely dropped their hands and ran terrified for the white van. They peeled out of my driveway in a sheer panic. The police sirens were right out front. Two heavily armed officers stood there. I pointed a firm finger directly at Brandon. He violently broke in. He orchestrated an assault on my sick wife. He attempted to illegally drug me against my will. The officer aggressively grabbed Brandon, spun him roughly around, and violently slapped the metal cuffs on him. Brittany screamed, "Do not touch my husband." "We are Harringtons." "No, you are absolutely not," I said coldly. "You are just pathetic thieves in incredibly expensive shoes." The officers violently dragged Brandon out the door and shoved him into the back of a dirty police cruiser. Friday arrived with the massive weight of a judge's gavel. We drove directly to the high-end title company located in downtown Boston. Leonard Sterling met us in the marble lobby. "They are already waiting upstairs, Mr. Bennett." Brandon easily made bail at 6 a.m. this morning. The massive conference room was incredibly vast. Rich Harrington sat aggressively at the head of the table. Brittany was aggressively checking her phone. Brandon sat nervously, smelling of cheap jail soap and pure fear. Rich Harrington aggressively slammed a thick folder shut. "I spent exactly $5,000 bailing this idiot kid out of jail this morning. You are going to immediately sign the property deed over to Harrington Development. Then, you are going to get completely out of our lives forever." I looked calmly at Rich. "Is that exactly how it works?" I asked innocently. Sterling slowly leaned forward. "Actually, Mr. Harrington, that letter of intent is exactly what we in the legal profession commonly call a completely worthless piece of trash. The residential property at 42 Oak Street was legally transferred entirely into the highly protected Bennett Family Trust exactly 48 hours before you forcefully coerced your father to sign that worthless paper." Rich Harrington aggressively grabbed the document. His face turned an incredibly darker shade of crimson. He violently threw the paper directly at Brandon. "You absolute idiot!" Rich yelled. "You confidently said he owned it." "Fine, the massive deal is completely dead. We will rapidly find another suitable lot." "Wait," I said quietly. Rich instantly stopped. "What do you want now, George?" He sneered. "I want to actively talk about the massive seaport expansion project," I said smoothly. "I know that Harrington Development aggressively took out a massive bridge loan of exactly $12 million just to break ground. I know that the massive loan is fully due next week." Rich Harrington completely froze. "How exactly do you know that?" He whispered in absolute horror. "It is completely public record if you actively buy the debt." Sterling interjected smoothly. "Your massive bridge loan was quietly sold this morning. The Bennett Family Trust now officially holds the massive note on your entire company." Brandon let out a terrible strangled sound. "Dad, that is $12 million. You absolutely do not have $12 million. I have a lot of powerful things you absolutely do not know about, Brandon," I said. I slowly turned back to the terrified room. "Mr. Harrington, your massive loan is fully callable. If you cannot pay the $12 million today, I immediately foreclose on you. I take your company." Rich completely collapsed into his leather chair. "George, please," he begged pathetically. "I have incredibly strict conditions," I said. "First, you will officially fire him." I pointed directly at Brandon. There was absolutely no hesitation. "He is completely fired," Rich stated firmly. "Done. Second," I commanded. "You will immediately apologize to my wife." Rich walked awkwardly over to Alice and muttered a pathetic apology. "And third," I commanded, "I want you to leave immediately, get entirely out of my sight." Rich aggressively grabbed his heavy briefcase. He and his wife aggressively fled exactly like terrified rats. Brandon and Brittany stood entirely alone. "Dad," Brandon begged softly, "how is this even possible? You are a lowly mechanic. I am a Bennett," I said proudly. "And Bennetts actively build things. We absolutely do not just steal names." Brittany's eyes were highly calculating. "George," she said sweetly, "this is absolutely amazing. You are a massive, secret millionaire. We could have massively celebrated together." "Stop," I commanded firmly. I turned slowly to Sterling. "Leonard, officially show them the rest." Sterling smoothly pulled out one absolute last document. "This is the official deed to the residential property at 42 Oak Street. The trust has aggressively decided to heavily develop the land. We are aggressively donating the massive land for a brand new, highly active waste management transfer station. A massive garbage dump, essentially. Brandon's jaw dropped completely open. You are intentionally turning our childhood home into a literal garbage dump? You are completely throwing away money. I am actively turning it into something highly useful, I said coldly. It is infinitely better than letting a Harrington live on it. You desperately wanted the fake prestige. Well, now you are completely unemployed. Your powerful father-in-law absolutely hates you, and you have absolutely no house, Dad, please. Brandon begged pathetically, the reality of his complete failure finally crashing down upon him. I am incredibly sorry. I made a massive mistake. I will legally change my name back right now. I will go directly to the court tomorrow morning. I will proudly be a Bennett again. I looked calmly at Sterling. Sterling slowly shook his head, his expression completely devoid of any pity. I am incredibly afraid that is completely impossible, Mr. Harrington, Sterling stated with absolute finality. The complex trust documents are quite highly specific. Once the name is legally renounced, it absolutely cannot be reclaimed for the purpose of inheritance. The bridge is completely burned to the ground. Inheritance. Brandon asked, his voice trembling violently. What massive inheritance? Sterling smiled. It was the terrifying smile of a highly professional executioner. We are absolutely not talking about the residential house, Mr. Harrington, Sterling said softly, or the massive $12 million corporate debt I just bought. We are actively talking about the Silas Bennett estate. Brandon looked at me in absolute shock. Grandpa Silas? He whispered, but he aggressively cut you off. He hated you. He died. I stated plainly. And he left absolutely everything to his only surviving son. How much? Brandon asked. His terrified voice was barely a squeak. I deliberately did not answer him. I looked at Sterling. Tell him, I commanded. Sterling looked directly at Brandon. He looked at Brittany, who was hanging on every single word. The estate is currently valued at exactly $60 million, Sterling announced loudly. Brittany screamed. It was a short, incredibly sharp sound of pure greed. She aggressively grabbed the mahogany table to steady herself. $60 million, Brandon repeated numbly. He looked exactly like he had just been violently shot in the chest. And under the incredibly strict terms of the will, Sterling continued ruthlessly, $30 million of that was specifically designated for the grandchild of George Bennett, provided he legally bore the family name. Brandon completely fell back into his leather chair. He put his heavy head directly on the polished table. He made a terrible sound exactly like a deeply wounded animal. $30 million. He had aggressively signed away $30 million just to impress a man who had just violently fired him. I looked down at my broken son. I honestly felt a tiny twinge of pity, but then I quickly remembered the white van. I remembered the terrifying syringe. I remembered the deep shame in his voice at the wedding. You exactly got what you wanted, Brandon, I said coldly. You are a completely self-made man now. You arrogantly started with absolutely nothing, and now you have absolutely nothing. I gently took Alice's arm. Come on, Alice, I said warmly. We have a massive plane to catch. Where exactly are you going? Brandon mumbled pathetically into the table. Italy, I said proudly. We are going to properly drink wine, real wine. We confidently walked out of the massive conference room. We completely left Brandon Harrington crying uncontrollably over a massive pile of useless legal papers. We aggressively left Brittany screaming violently at him. We completely left the sharks to violently eat each other alive. We walked to the glass elevator. The shiny doors opened smoothly. We stepped inside. As the heavy doors slowly closed, I looked back one absolute last time. I saw my son slowly lifting his heavy head. He looked directly at me. His eyes were completely full of immense regret. But regret is incredibly free, and he had aggressively paid absolute full price for his massive arrogance. The elevator went smoothly down. We went out into the busy street. The heavy rain had completely stopped. The bright sun was finally breaking through the dark clouds. It was an incredibly beautiful day to proudly be a Bennett. The highly official legal summons violently arrived at Brandon's temporary address, his rich in-law's basement on Saturday morning. It was a heavy, cream-colored envelope legally sealed with red wax. Inside, a single sheet of heavy paper, formally requested the immediate presence of all potential beneficiaries of the Silas Bennett Trust at the highly secure offices of Sterling & Associates in Boston on Monday at exactly 10:00 a.m. I knew Brandon would absolutely come. Despite the massive humiliation at the title company, despite violently losing his job, despite being aggressively thrown out of his own life, he would definitely come. Hope is an incredibly dangerous drug for a desperate man. He would desperately convince himself that I was just an angry father trying to teach him a harsh lesson. He would falsely tell himself that blood is thicker than water. He would foolishly tell himself that $60 million cannot simply vanish into thin air. He would desperately think there was a legal loophole. He would arrogantly think he could outsmart a dead man. Monday morning was incredibly crisp and bright. The sky was a piercing, vibrant blue that almost physically hurt the eyes. Alice and I arrived at the massive law offices exactly 15 minutes early. The highly exclusive firm occupied the entire top 3 floors of the massive Prudential Center. The formal conference room was completely different from the one at the title company. This was absolutely not a place for aggressive business deals. This was a place for absolute, final judgment. The dark walls were completely lined with heavy, leather-bound books that strongly smelled of dust and unyielding authority. The massive table was perfectly made of solid black marble. It felt incredibly cold to the touch. Leonard Sterling sat powerfully at the very head of the table. He did not look like a man who had just aggressively flown in from New York. He looked exactly like he had been permanently carved out of the massive chair itself. He wore a dark charcoal suit that completely absorbed the light. His hands were neatly folded on top of a massive, thick legal file. We sat quietly on the left side. Alice proudly wore a brand new, incredibly expensive dress she had specifically bought for our trip to Italy. It was a deep, vibrant blue. It perfectly brought out the bright color of her eyes. She gently held my hand. Her grip was completely loose, relaxed. She was no longer incredibly afraid of anything. At exactly 10 a.m., the heavy oak doors slowly opened. Brandon slowly walked in. He was completely alone. Brittany was not with him. Rich Harrington was not with him. He looked exactly like a man who had absolutely not slept in 3 full days. His suit was deeply wrinkled. His expensive tie was completely crooked. He had carelessly cut himself shaving on his jaw. But his eyes were incredibly feverish. They darted rapidly around the massive room, aggressively assessing the luxury, actively assessing the immense cost of everything. When he saw me, he forcefully straightened his spine. He desperately tried to summon the massive arrogance he had worn at his wedding, but it was a completely thin, highly transparent mask. He sat down heavily on the right side of the marble table, directly opposite us. He placed a cheap notepad and a pen on the cold marble. He desperately tried to look like a serious businessman. He looked exactly like a terrified defendant. "Good morning, Brandon," I said calmly. "Dad." He nodded nervously. His voice was incredibly tight. "Look, about Friday, I know things got incredibly heated. Rich was totally out of line. Brittany is, well, she's highly stressed, but we're family. I'm incredibly glad we're doing this formally. I'm glad we're finally looking at the massive big picture." He was incredibly already spinning the narrative. He was already desperately trying to aggressively bridge the massive gap he had violently burned. Sterling ruthlessly cleared his throat. The incredibly sharp sound was exactly like a heavy gavel violently striking wood. "This is absolutely not a mediation, Mr. Harrington," Sterling stated coldly. "This is a highly formal legal reading of the strict trust distribution schedule, strictly pursuant to the death of Mr. Silas Bennett." Brandon looked nervously at Sterling. "Who is Silas Bennett?" "My father," I said. "Your grandfather." Brandon frowned deeply. "You confidently said he was a terrible drunk who died penniless in a ditch." "I specifically said he was a massive tyrant who I permanently left behind," I firmly corrected. "I never once said he was poor." Sterling aggressively opened the thick file. He did not look at Brandon. He looked directly at the legal papers. "Let us begin," Sterling commanded. "The massive estate of Silas Bennett has been completely liquidated and heavily consolidated into the Bennett Family Trust. All massive debts have been completely settled. All massive taxes have been fully paid. The absolute total value of the highly distributable assets, including liquid cash, massive securities, and major equity in Bennett Steel. It's exactly $62,400,000. Brandon loudly gasped. It was a wet, desperately sucking sound. His bloodshot eyes bulged massively. He looked wildly at me, then frantically back at Sterling. He was rapidly doing the massive math in his head. He was desperately calculating massive percentages. He was greedily buying mansions in his mind. He was desperately buying his way back into the Harringtons' favor. I could clearly see the intense greed completely washing over his face, instantly erasing the deep shame, erasing the sheer fear. 62 million, that's absolutely incredible. Brandon breathed heavily. Sterling continued, his voice completely devoid of any inflection. The massive trust strictly divides the highly liquid assets into two exactly equal portions. Portion A, consisting of exactly 50% of the entire estate, is strictly designated for the sole surviving biological child of Silas Bennett. That specific beneficiary is Mr. George Bennett. Sterling smoothly slid a highly official document directly toward me. Mr. Bennett, the massive funds have been securely deposited into your highly private offshore account as of early this morning. Exactly $2 million. I completely ignored the paper. I looked directly at Brandon. He was massively smiling. He was actually, genuinely smiling. He firmly thought this was the absolute preamble to his own massive payday. He firmly thought that if I comfortably got $30 million, he was definitely next in line. Sterling slowly turned the page. Portion B, consisting of the massive remaining 50%, is strictly designated for the direct lineal descendants of George Bennett. This specifically creates a highly complex generation-skipping transfer, strictly intended to permanently secure the massive family legacy for the grandchildren. Brandon aggressively leaned forward. He was practically vibrating with intense greed. "That's me," he stated proudly. "I'm the only child. I'm the absolute direct descendant." Sterling completely stopped reading. He slowly looked up over his expensive glasses. He looked directly at Brandon with an intense expression that might have been pure pity if terrifying sharks could ever actually feel pity. The highly complex document has incredibly specific legal qualifiers regarding Portion B, Sterling stated coldly. Qualifiers? Brandon asked, his smile faltering slightly. What kind of stupid qualifiers? I'm his only son. It's totally automatic. Sterling smoothly pulled a single, highly delicate sheet of paper from the thick file. It was incredibly old. The edges were deeply yellowed. It was the absolute original trust charter signed by my ruthless father exactly 20 years ago. Silas Bennett was a highly strict man of deep tradition, Sterling said. He firmly believed that the ultimate strength of an entire family was held entirely in its powerful name. He firmly believed that any man who did not proudly carry his father's specific name absolutely did not carry his father's blood. Sterling began to read clearly from the yellowed paper. To be legally eligible for Portion B, any grandchild or direct descendant absolutely must, at the precise time of the final distribution, legally and publicly bear the surname Bennett. Furthermore, any descendant who has voluntarily taken legal action to actively remove, alter, or permanently renounce the Bennett surname shall be legally deemed to have completely severed their own lineage. They shall be treated legally as having predeceased the grantor. Their entire share shall be instantly voided and permanently returned to the massive charitable remainder trust. The massive room went completely silent. The expensive air conditioning hummed faintly. A car honked 40 floors directly below. Brandon sat completely frozen in his chair. His mouth was slightly open. He blinked once, then twice. He was physically hearing the words, but his arrogant brain was violently refusing to accept their absolute reality. "What?" he whispered in sheer disbelief. "It is the strict name clause," Sterling stated incredibly calmly. "It is quite highly standard in massive old money trusts. It permanently ensures the absolute continuity of the powerful family identity." Brandon let out an incredibly nervous laugh. It sounded exactly like a terrified bark. That's incredibly archaic. That absolutely can't be legal. You can't legally condition a massive inheritance on a stupid name. "I completely assure you, Mr. Harrington, it is entirely legal," Sterling said. "It is a highly private trust. The wealthy grantor can place almost absolutely any strict condition he wishes on the massive gift. The condition here is incredibly simple. You absolutely must be a Bennett to legally inherit massive Bennett money. Brandon aggressively stood up. His heavy chair scraped violently against the cold marble floor. I absolutely am a Bennett, he shouted frantically. I was born Brandon Bennett. My official birth certificate clearly says Bennett. Sterling slowly opened a dark side folder. He smoothly pulled out a massive framed document. It was the exact mahogany frame I had proudly placed on my mantel. It was the exact court order Brandon had arrogantly sent me to rub his new name in my face. Sterling placed the massive frame squarely in the exact center of the marble table. The shiny silver edge perfectly caught the bright light. This is a formal decree of change of name, Sterling stated coldly. Officially dated October 14th, legally filed in Suffolk Probate Court. Personally signed by you, officially signed by a judge. He tapped the pristine glass with his index finger. In this binding document, you formally petitioned the court to legally and permanently change your name to Brandon James Harrington. You clearly stated under strict oath that you wish to permanently abandon the name Bennett. You explicitly cited personal preference and professional branding as your absolute reasons. Brandon stared in absolute horror at the heavy frame. He stared directly at his own signature. He looked exactly like he was staring at a terrifying ghost. I can easily change it back, he stammered frantically, panic taking over. I'll instantly file an emergency petition. It was a massive mistake. Sterling slowly shook his head. I am afraid that does not matter, Sterling said. The strict clause is highly specific. The act of renunciation is the permanent disqualifier. The exact moment that judge stamped this paper, you violently triggered the clause. It is absolutely irrevocable, but I didn't know. Brandon screamed in absolute terror. He violently slammed his hands on the marble table. If I had known, I absolutely wouldn't have done it. I spoke up for the first time. That is the entire point, Brandon, I said coldly. He turned to me, his face beat red. Dad, you have to stop this. It's $30 million. You can't let them give it to charity because of a stupid piece of paper. I didn't let them do anything, I said calmly. You proudly stood on a well-lit stage and told 300 wealthy people you were deeply ashamed of me. You wanted to be a Harrington so incredibly badly. Well, you successfully bought the name Harrington, and the final price was exactly $30 million. Brandon looked desperately at Alice. Mom, please tell him. Give me my share. Alice looked directly at him, fresh tears in her eyes. We can't fix it, Brandon, she said softly. You broke it. You made us feel incredibly small so you could feel incredibly big. Now you want us to pay for your massive mistake. I am your only son. He yelled frantically. No, I said firmly. You are a Harrington, and wealthy Harringtons don't need pathetic handouts from poor mechanics. Brandon collapsed back into his chair, sobbing uncontrollably. He was violently grieving the massive life he firmly thought he was about to have. Sterling efficiently closed the thick file. The $31, $2 million specifically designated for Portion B has been unofficially transferred to the Bennett Charitable Foundation. Sterling stated smoothly. It will provide vocational scholarships for young mechanics. This concludes the formal reading. Brandon did not move. I stood up and gently helped Alice. Dad, Brandon croaked miserably. Rich fired me. Brittany kicked me out. I have nothing left. I stopped. You have an expensive name, I said coldly. Wear it proudly. Suddenly, Brandon let out a terrifying scream. He violently lunged across the table, grabbed the heavy mahogany frame, and smashed it against the marble edge. The thick glass completely exploded. He violently clawed at the paper inside, tearing the official decree into tiny shreds. His bare hands were bleeding. I undo it. He screamed insanely. I take it all back. The paper is gone. I am Brandon Bennett. Give me the massive money. Leonard Sterling did not flinch. Mr. Harrington, Sterling said calmly, violently destroying a physical copy does not negate the binding legal judgment. The absolute record exists permanently in the state archives. You cannot tear up the truth. Brandon stared in absolute horror at the pathetic pile of torn paper. He fell to his bleeding knees. Dad, please help me. I cannot help you, Brandon, I said firmly. You made a choice. Go to the Harringtons. They are right outside, he whispered pathetically. Brittany is waiting in the reception room. She wanted to know exactly how much we got. Of course she was. Sterling calmly pressed the intercom. Security to the main conference room. Escort Mr. Harrington entirely out of the building. Two massive security guards aggressively grabbed Brandon and hauled him entirely out of the room. We followed. In the plush reception area, Brittany was casually sitting on a highly expensive leather sofa. When she saw Brandon being dragged, his suit torn and hands bleeding, her greedy smile vanished instantly. "Brandon," she snapped, "what are you doing? Did you get the massive money?" Brandon weakly shook his head. "No, it is completely gone." "What do you mean gone?" Brittany demanded furiously. "How much did he give you?" "Nothing," Brandon whispered entirely. "Absolute zero. He legally disinherited me. Because I legally changed my name to Harrington. I permanently lost $30 million. Brittany completely froze. 30 million. Her eyes went incredibly wide. There was absolutely no love in her face, only pure, unadulterated, violent rage. "You absolute idiot!" she screamed. She actually kicked him hard in the shoulder with her sharp heel. "You arrogantly changed your name just to impress my father. And you actively cost us exactly $30 million. She turned to me. "George," she said rapidly, her tone instantly becoming incredibly pleading. "We can entirely fix this. I can physically make him change it completely back. I am currently carrying your very first grandchild." "Stop actively lying, Brittany," I said coldly. "There is absolutely no grandchild. You only love exactly what he can massively give you. And right now he can actively give you absolutely nothing." Brittany's beautiful face violently twisted. "You pathetic old miser." She spat aggressively. "You are violently hoarding it." The heavy elevator doors suddenly opened. Rich Harrington aggressively stepped out. He saw the chaotic scene. "What exactly is actively going on here? Where exactly is the massive check?" Brittany aggressively pointed at Brandon. "He violently lost it. Dad, he lost $30 million because he arrogantly took your stupid name." Rich instantly stopped. "Is this actually true?" Rich asked me directly. "It is absolutely true," I said. "The incredibly proud Harrington name completely cost my arrogant son his massive inheritance." Rich's face instantly turned bright purple. "You absolute fool," Rich roared at Brandon. "You completely incompetent idiot. You actively bring me absolutely nothing but massive debt and sheer failure." He violently turned to me. "George, about the massive loan, we can absolutely work something out. There are absolutely no rights." "Rich," I said coldly, "the massive loan is completely due. I fully expect absolute payment in full by next week." Rich stared at me, seeing the absolute end of his fake empire. He turned violently back to Brandon. "You are completely fired," Rich said deadly. "Do not ever come back." "Dad," Brittany cried out. "What about me?" "Come home immediately, Brittany," Rich commanded. "Leave him entirely. He is absolute dead weight." Brittany nodded eagerly. She quickly took off her massive diamond wedding ring and violently threw it directly at Brandon. It bounced onto the carpet. "I eagerly want an immediate divorce," she said coldly. "You are completely broke. You are absolute nothing." She aggressively walked over to her father. They walked rapidly toward the elevators. "You completely win, George," Rich said bitterly. "I absolutely did not destroy him," I said firmly. "You completely did. You arrogantly taught him that massive money was the absolute only thing that actively mattered." Rich sneered violently. The heavy doors opened and they left. Brandon was left completely alone on the expensive floor, tightly holding the diamond ring in his bloody hand. He had violently lost his high-end job, his demanding wife, his massive family, his massive fortune, and his very name. "Dad," he whispered pathetically, "please, I have nowhere else to go." Alice was actively crying, but she did not move an inch toward him. She held my strong arm. "You absolutely have an expensive name, Brandon," I said coldly. "It is Harrington. Ask them for massive help. They absolutely hate me," he sobbed loudly. "Then become absolutely someone else," I commanded. "Become a powerful man who absolutely doesn't desperately need a fancy name to be worth something in this world." I turned firmly to Sterling. "We are completely done here." Brandon stood up shakily. He looked desperately at us one absolute last time, then slowly walked heavily toward the heavy door and disappeared into the dark stairwell. 3 incredibly long months is an absolute eternity when you are actively poor. But exactly when you are incredibly rich, 3 short months is just a single breath. Alice and I happily spent October entirely in Tuscany. We happily drank rare wine that tasted exactly like pure sunshine. The highly expensive doctors confidently told us her failing heart was getting incredibly strong. The massive stress was completely gone. Now it was early December. We were happily back in Boston. The rotting house on Oak Street was completely gone. The massive city bulldozers had violently come last week to pour the concrete foundation for the brand new waste transfer station. We happily lived in a massive, luxurious penthouse on the 35th floor of the Millennium Tower. It was violently raining tonight, a completely freezing rain. The security intercom buzzed loudly. "Mr. Bennett," the polite doorman said, "there is an incredibly disheveled man here to see you. He aggressively claims he is your son." I looked at the high-resolution video screen. Brandon stood completely soaked near the desk. He looked exactly 20 years older. "Send him completely up." "James," I commanded. I smoothly opened the heavy door. Brandon stood pathetically there, dripping filthy water onto the expensive marble. He smelled terribly of wet wool and cheap, disgusting alcohol. "Dad," he rasped pathetically, "can I please come in? I am actively sleeping in a dangerous shelter. Let me eagerly sleep completely on the hard floor." He violently fell to his freezing knees. "I will aggressively change my name entirely back. I will eagerly be Brandon Bennett again." I looked down at him. I clearly remembered the grand wedding. "I am ashamed to be his son. Stand up, Brandon," I commanded firmly. "You absolutely cannot change your name back, not for me. You proudly told the entire world you were a wealthy Harrington. But I absolutely hate them." He cried loudly. "That absolutely does not matter," I stated. I aggressively reached into my pocket, pulled out my old leather wallet, and confidently pulled out a single $20 bill. "Here," I said. He stared violently at the small money. "$20? You actively have massive millions." "It absolutely was never entirely yours," I said. "It specifically belonged to a proud Bennett. You are a Harrington. Take a cab to the local shelter. But you are actually my biological father." He whispered violently. "My real son tragically died the exact night he violently changed his name," I said. "You are absolutely just a pathetic stranger with a completely familiar face. Go actively be a Harrington." "Brandon, Dad, no. Don't aggressively close the heavy door. It is incredibly dark out there." "It has absolutely always been dark for us," I said coldly. "We just successfully learned to actively make our own bright light. You foolishly blew yours completely out." I completely closed the massive door and firmly locked the heavy deadbolt. I confidently walked back to the warm living room. "Is he completely gone?" Alice asked softly. "He is entirely gone," I confirmed. I sat back down comfortably in my massive armchair. "Kyoto looks absolutely beautiful in April," I said warmly. Alice happily wiped her dry eyes and smiled a massive, peaceful smile. "Yes, the beautiful cherry blossoms. I actively read that they permanently represent massive renewal." "Massive renewal," I echoed peacefully. "That sounds absolutely perfect. If you truly enjoyed this story, please actively hit the like button and aggressively subscribe to the massive channel for more. What exactly would you have actively done if your arrogant son came back desperately knocking in the cold rain? Let me clearly know your exact thoughts in the comments entirely below. This entire experience has been a massive learning curve for me. I learned that you cannot actively buy loyalty, and you certainly cannot forcefully demand respect from someone who has absolutely none for themselves. The massive money did not actively change who I was, but it completely revealed exactly who everyone else truly was. Brandon violently chose the massive illusion of wealth over the absolute reality of family, and he actively paid the ultimate price for it. The incredibly wealthy Harrington family actively chose massive arrogance over genuine human connection, and they completely lost their fake empire. As for Alice and me, we are actively living our absolute best life. We are incredibly happy. We are genuinely at peace. We actively use our massive resources to quietly help people who actually need it and who genuinely appreciate it. We actively support the local community. We heavily fund massive trade school scholarships, and we actively travel the world together. The massive Bennett name will actively live on, not through a deeply ungrateful son, but through the massive positive impact we are aggressively making in the world today. Thank you so much for actively listening to my story. Stay incredibly safe, always value your true family, and never ever let anyone make you aggressively feel small, just so they can desperately feel big.